I grew up, I moved to Milwaukee from Chicago in 76. And you were still on 27th Street back then, right? Is that where you Silver Spring?
Actually, I didn't get to Milwaukee, Jim, until 1980. I was in Madison.
Okay.
I got to Madison in, I want to say, March of 77. Then I came over here in March of 80. So I was in the state, and, I once in a while I'd get to Milwaukee to cover things, but full time in Milwaukee since 1980.
So you missed that beautiful structure on Silver Spring in 27th. You came into the new building?
Actually, I did work there when uh, 24 was there, when we were on. Over the air on 18 and 24, I worked out of that building a
That's
little.
amazing. I
Yeah,
coming up from Chicago, Albert the Alley Cat was kind of a kick for us. And Tom Skilling went to Chicago, ironically, after I left. But yeah, what did
no,
you
Tom, I worked with Jack DuBlanc and Albert. I talked to the puppet many times on the air, so it
all
was
right,
great.
be honest though, was it difficult to do that? Because I might have had a little trouble with that.
He was so good and so sharp and so witty and so intelligent
Okay.
that you would forget you were talking to a dish rag.
Well, let me put it this way. I bet you got a better conversation out of Albert than some NBA players.
I got a pretty good. I might have gotten a better discussion with Albert than some people in general.
I like that. It's just, when I'm talking to you, I covered the Brewers since '92. I wrote for Mario Zeno for a
Sure.
long time. We know the same people, even though you and I mean, I used to see at the Bucks games all the time. I just, didn't bother when you were working with John McLaughlin and just such an era, of the Bradley Center and before that. So what year did you start with the Bucks?
That was 86, 87 was my first year with the Bucks, and then my first Brewer season was 87.
So
The 13-0 start.
I just don't understand how you could fit all that in. Like I know Brian Anderson a little bit, and even him taking on the playoffs with the NBA. How did you number one think you could do that? And apparently you did. But how did you get that in your mind that you could do both?
Well,
Baseball.
we were only doing 30 Bucks games, Jim, and 60 Brewer games. So when I went full time with the Bucks, we were pushing 80 games, so it wasn't that much difference. And
Okay.
then when I got into the 90s, mid 90s, when I went back to the Brewers, then we started doing 125 baseball and we were doing 60 bucks. And then I realized that was too much for one person for the audience, and it was pretty stressful on the family and that type of thing. But it was just a matter of the number of games
Yeah.
that
Okay.
it increased over the years from 90 between the two to almost 200 between the two.
I have something coming up soon. If I say the date, it'll make this interview old. But on the 13th of March, I think I emailed you on this.
Yeah, you did.
I'm
Yeah,
finally getting together these guys. I don't know how if you ever sat in the loge, but for us, it was a family. I mean, we had Dan Manella, Len Casper, all these young, relatively young guys. And there's something about that loge, Jim, it holds some, you hate to say romantic, but you had Euchre up here, right above you, and you had all these guys in this tin corrugated shelf, if you will, with old metal chairs that were probably used in surplus from World War I. But there was such a family there. Did you get down there once in a while? And can you at least relate to the kind of way 25 years later people have thanked me for putting this little gathering together? But it really is the first time in 25 years, Jim, since this new place. I love the nostalgia. And do you get it? Is it nice to revisit some of that?
hey, the Loge. I can tell you a story about the Loge from the first Brewer game I covered
I'm
when I came to
listening. I'm
Milwaukee.
listening.
You want to hear it now, or are
Oh
we?
God, yeah. Oh God, yeah. If
Are we?
it's anything you want, this is
Are
the
we?
we
We're
can
on.
work blue. Oh, we've been on for a while.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh yeah. I just
I assume when you were talking about Phil and stuff that we may
no.
not be, but
I'm just gonna take Phil out because that's not fair. But now I gotta edit this out. So yeah, we're going. So tell me the Lowe's story.
Well, opening day of 1980, I was on the Lowe's. It was a rainy day, not a great day weather-wise, and I was sitting next to Ron Swoboda, who happened to play for the New York Mets and made a
Mets,
great
yeah.
catch in the '69 World Series.
69 Mets. God, I'm old.
And he was on my right, and we're watching the game. It was a wonderful game, took a long time to play, and it was the game where Sixto Lezcano ended the game with a home run, a big
Yeah.
home run. And all I remember is Ron, as the ball was leaving the park, Ron put his arm across my chest and said, "Get up and move back." And we moved back against the press box, and a cascade of beer came over from the upper deck right where we were sitting. So I tip my hat to a World Series champion for knowing Milwaukee's drinking habits in a big moment like that. And I'll never forget that. That was my first Brewer game as a Milwaukee sportscaster. I'd been to other games as a Madison sportscaster, but that was my first game
Well, you
as
and I
a.
have something in common then, because my very first night in 1992, I had never gone to school for broadcasting. I'm a history undergrad and a master's in labor relations and media negotiations, mediation. I just started writing and started in radio at YMS and then TMJ later, but in a morning show on QFM, if you can believe it. But my first night, I got credentialed by Tom Skybosh, okay? And I remember in those days, the kid, I wrote a letter, like a 4-page letter asking for a credential, right? Because I thought it was hallowed ground, and it was, So I get out there, I'm wearing a jacket, a blazer and a white shirt when everyone else is in their pajamas. And so I get down, walk down the loge, and I'm, trying to pretend like I belong. So of course, a foul ball, about 300 miles an hour comes up there and hits the wall behind us, a corrugated shack. And you instinctively, as a red-blooded American, go for the ball. I mean, I don't care what you're doing because it came right to you. And if you remember Larry Bandy, he went for it too. And I swear, Bob Euchre goes, Larry Bandy and some new guy are going for that foul ball. So here I am, 2 minutes into my reporting career, and I got Euchre commenting on it, which is a great segue to Bob. Talk to me about
Right. And, one more story on the
it.
Loja. Hey, remember that little lower indentation to the far left?
Where
You'd
you would,
walk.
yeah, that little pit, a
There was,
little, was it a photography pit or what was that?
yeah, it was real small, but there were two seats in there, two of those metal folding
I know
pits,
it.
right? So this is when I'm calling Brewer games, and on off days, in terms of the telecast, I'd always go to the ballpark for the game, and very often I would take my son. He was very small at that time. I don't even know what he would have been. Let's see, 4 or 5 years old. And we always sat down away from everybody in those two seats.
Yeah.
And then one day we we came out and we intended to do the same thing, and there were two people in our seats. And my son breaks out in tears, crying, just beside himself. He thought those were his seats. So and Bob Euchre was wonderful. When my son was at the ballpark, he would say, "Come on upstairs, Mike," and he'd take him behind the counter with Marty and Ed and the Wellscoffs, and he would say, "Mike, there's candy back here. Take whatever you want."
Two things on Bob. I didn't know him well, but he was always gracious to me. I have no reason to say anything else. He was kind, I was nothing, and he said hello all the time. We didn't hang out together, but Milwaukee's going to miss him, I think, more than just the Brewers. What do you think his legacy is to the city, not just baseball?
Well, first of all, he's a one of a kind human being. We all know that. And I agree. He treated me that way too. I didn't hang out with Bob. I traveled with him for 7 seasons on the same plane. And, um, I worked on television. He was on radio. We were always cordial. He was always great to me, and treated me very well. And, I had a lot of people when I was doing television for the Brewers, they would say, "What's it like working in the shadow of Bob Euchre?" And I said, "Shadow?" I said, "There's no shadow. You think giants cast shadows, but giants cast immense light."
I like that.
And I really appreciated working in that light because it tells you something about yourself. It's a quick read on whether you belong there or not. Light disinfects, right? And if you don't belong there, you're going to know it in a hurry. So
That's interesting.
I always respected that, and I'm very grateful for being able to work in that orbit and that light. And I've had the great fortune in my career to work in the light of some pretty phenomenal broadcasters. I can reel them off, but the guys in Milwaukee were phenomenal. Earl Gillespie, Merle Harmon, Jim Irwin, certainly Eddie Doucette with the Bucks, even though he was gone when I took over. That light was still white hot, and on and on it goes. Brian Anderson, cast that kind of a light. So when you work in that environment, I always looked at it as just a blessing to be able to be around people like that, and it set the bar very high, which is what I seek, and I always sought that. I wanted a high bar because I always believed that if you can't reach the high bar, you probably should be doing something else, and this business tends to prove that to us over time. And so Bob's light was as bright as it gets, and I'm truly grateful for being around him for as many years as I have been. I've known him now since the late 70s. I actually got to do a radio game with him. Merle Harmon somehow figured out a way to get me in there when he was gone one time, and I worked with Bob in Boston, and I'll never forget that. It was a one-off for me, but it's a one-off that is right at the top of my list. It was phenomenal. I really enjoyed it.
He sat down for me a project I was doing for Bruce Fleming. It was kind of thought it was a documentary, but it was more of an unfortunate love letter to the guy who I don't know that was that well loved. You know, it's funny in the interviews, nobody wanted to talk ill of him, but I had a feeling there was some kind of animosity. But he sat down for me, Bob did, and he gave me at first he was a little trepidatious and a little, but after 5 or 10 minutes he was rolling, and that man was truly extemporaneously funny. I mean,
Oh,
take baseball out of the equation. He could have been or was, but he had a comedic timing and the cadence and I mean, that's a gift to have that. I mean, fact that he happened to be a good broadcaster, that's great. But as a talent, he had a lot more than I think people realize. I never watched Mr. Belvedere, so I can't say. But you know what I'm getting at? That he had a true comedic timing.
well, that's why I said he's one of a kind. And I think the fact that he was on the Tonight Show over 100 times with one of the great comedians of all time, Johnny Carson, and
He
then
knew
the
what he was
people
doing.
brought on that Bob was with on that show and held his own, if not exceeded a lot of people, is testament to that. Uh, Absolutely brilliant comedic timing and talent. And that was every day. That's the
Yeah.
amazing thing to me. It wasn't that he had that because you can build that, you can construct that, you can program that, but you can't program it when that's who you are all the
You
time.
can't
And
fake it. Like you can't have
oh no,
Brian Anderson trying to be Bob Uecker. It's one of those things where you just can't. It's an intangible and an innate thing that you cannot fake.
well, just that humor. I mean, how do you that has to be intrinsic to be that funny that often. I mean, and it was
Right.
every single time I've been around him, he's been hilarious. He'll
Yeah.
find something and he'll have a good time with it and he'll make you laugh. And that's what we'll all miss more than anything, I think. Of course, we'll miss his work and his voice. He's the soundtrack of our summers here and will always be. And but that when you're with him in the dugout or you're
Yeah.
talking to him, in the manager's office or outside the manager's office, those are just beautiful moments that always stick with you.
He was present. You know what I mean? When he asked you a question, he truly wanted to know the answer. And you have people that talk, listen, waiting to take their turn to talk, but you got the feeling that he was immersed in it. And when you see him celebrate the later teams, you could really see it in his face. He was truly part of it and enjoying it. And, he's a breath of fresh air in a lot of ways. And I don't mean to lament, people pass, but he's one of the big ones. He's one of these guys that could have gone anywhere. He could have been in New York. He could have been LA. He could have
Oh,
anywhere.
easily. Well, he networked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you know what
And
I mean.
yeah,
Mike
absolutely.
Boucher in Milwaukee had that too. Mike Boucher, I think, could have gone anywhere.
Yes.
They knew
Yeah.
what they had. I wanted to touch on, you talked about longevity here, or we were kind of alluding to it with Bob, but even our local radio stations, Dave Luzak just retired, right? And the other two guys on the Hog, Bob and Brad, very smart guys. who've lasted what 30 years. Does that happen in other towns? Is that intrinsic to Milwaukee? Or I mean, I just can't. The other towns are too vicious. Like I remember Robin. I've never spent any time with Robin, but John Adam and he are pretty tight. And Kid said that he liked Milwaukee because my take on it is, even a guy like him would have been lambasted for some things, and like Aaron Rodgers gets to New York and he got his nose full. And I'm thinking something about Milwaukee. What is it? Is it unique or is it something that you see in other cities? But just this longevity, and I'm tying it into the '82 Brewers because people in Milwaukee, if they know you're giving your all, you can stay there forever. I mean, there's that deep connection.
I think it's a two-way situation, Jim. I think that is the cornerstone. The people here are wonderful. They give you a chance. They give you a second chance. They're benevolent. If you're one of theirs, they will keep you here. They will appreciate you. And I think the second part of it is Milwaukee is simply a great place to live,
Mhm.
work, and play. And the people just round it off. I mean, I'm from Minnesota, but once I got to Milwaukee, I knew this, after a very short time, I knew this would be home. And I still feel that way. I love it here. I love the people here. I love the situation. I love the whole thing. And so I think it's just a special place. And as far as longevity, I think we've seen I think we see it in other cities and other markets, but I don't know if we see it to the extent we see it here. You can have four or five people at a time who have been here for 20, 30, 40 years.
Mhm.
And while I'm thinking about it, Tony Migliaccio, the great
Oh, he's really good friends with John Adam.
clubhouse. He
Yeah.
runs the clubhouse for the Brewers and has for many, many years. And he's a very close friend, was a very close friend of Bob Uecker. They were always together.
No, and
And
these do the
talk about
commercials
long,
together. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You talk about longevity. I happened to be at Davy Nelson's memorial
Hmm.
at the ballpark, and Bob and Tony walk in, and I'm sure it was at Bob's prompting, but Tony walks in and said, "Hey, Bob, the flash in the pan's here." I've been in the market for 40
Tony's
some
that quick to come up with that, or Bob said that.
Bob, Tony said it, but I'm thinking, okay, Tony, that's pretty good if you did it, but I wonder. But I laughed at that, and I still laugh at
That's
that.
funny.
They called me the flash in the pan.
Oh, that's clever. There was a story Tony related to me about being in the A's locker room. They were out there, and the clubhouse manager of the A's, you may know him. He was an older, crusty old guy, and he goes, "Come here, kid." And so Tony goes over and he goes, "Give the kid an autograph." And it was Joe DiMaggio. So Joe DiMaggio is a guy I didn't like giving an autograph, but here he is. And what really struck me about that story is if you're in, you're in. You know what I mean? He knew this kid wasn't asking for. I just love that story because here's Joe DiMaggio, who probably didn't want to sign for any, but gladly doing that. And that's what I love about what I've been able to do. I've had a rather strange, I'm hesitant to call it a career because I've always been on the periphery of stuff, Jim. Been fortunate. I truly feel blessed because I've been able to do one of my fondest memories, well, I have many of them, was walking into Miller Park with Greg Maddox. I'm coming in from right field. Remember, you came in and it was 10 a.m., right, which was my favorite time of day to go in there, and we're walking literally side by side. And I've been around enough not to be agape about these guys, but I said, "Hey, Greg, did you stay at Mike's place?" Because Mike was the pitching coach at the time. He goes, "Oh, heck no." He says, "Those kids would have kept me up all night." And I love those little interactions, and Ted Simmons was great. And I have to tell you, I got to tell my story now, the Loge. I was sitting there, and Lenny Casper and I were really tight before he, blew up and became, he's great. He's done more for me than most people. But I'm sitting there, and I blew up my ear in an airplane going into DC many years ago. I had a cold, probably shouldn't have been flying. No, I shouldn't have been flying. And so I've got tinnitus and it's 80% loss here. So I'm talking to Len, and when Len and I were out there, I talked about anything but baseball. It's usually film. And so I'm like this talking to Len to my right, and you hear this. He goes, "Jimmy," and he goes, and I swear, Jim, the ball, I would have been a drooling vegetable or dead. It honestly was a lifesaver, and then his hand was all red, and I said, "I want the ball." He goes like, "Hell, you're getting the ball," and He literally, it's in the book as my memory as thank you for all your comments in there. And it was weird how many people could say they had their life saved in the Lowe's. I was lucky. So, what do you do when you're not? Do you read, watch film? I'm curious, we know about your love of sport, or is it a love of sports? Do you have to love it to do it? I know that sounds really off in left field, but some people do things, for the career or the money. But when did your love of sports start?
Well, that's a very good question, and I appreciate you asking it and understanding that there are different ways to love sports. And my story is, I don't know if it's unique. Well, all of our stories are unique. Jim, I started my affiliation with pro sports when I was 14 years old. I was in the eighth grade, 1965. The Minnesota Twins were in the World Series with the Los Angeles Dodgers at Old Met Stadium.
Harmon
And
Killebrew was he on that squad?
pardon me,
Was Harmon Killebrew on that squad?
Armin Killebrew was my childhood idol.
My first mitt
Uh,
was Harmon Killebrew.
yeah, yeah. He was just a wonderful human being. So I'm walking home from school one day, and one of the neighbor kids, a little older than me, said, "Jim, can you work as an usher for Game 6 of the World Series?" And I said, "Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I can." I was 2 years underage, but in October they couldn't find people to work. So my first day earning a paycheck was Game 6 of the World Series. My second day was Game 7. I worked the third level, section 7 and 9. Um, Mr. Horn was my supervisor. I remember everything about it. I walked in and I thought, boy, this is amazing. So for me, I'm not a guy who remembers every score. I remember a lot of them, but I remember the spectacle. I was drawn to the spectacle of sport. And I have a book sitting right below me here. It was the first book my parents ever bought me. It was a Sports Illustrated coffee table book entitled The Spectacle of Sport.
Oh my
And this
goodness.
this was in the 50s, and it has pictures of all of the sports all around the world. And I have kept that near me my entire
That's
life since
interesting.
I got it. And that's sort of how I've always looked at the world of sports is I'm drawn to the spectacle of sport.
Oh,
And
elaborate on that a little bit because I take that as, like I do. I love the intangibles. I used to leave a game at the sixth inning because frankly, I don't like crowds and I was bored by that point. I like the BP and I like being on that field. But what do you mean by spectacle?
well, when you walk into Game 6 of a World Series in 1965, you feel the aura of the event. Everybody was dressed in suits,
Right.
and it was a different time, but it was, you could feel the energy and you feel the excitement. That's what I think is a spectacle. Big events are spectacles to me.
Hmm.
I've been to World Series. I haven't called World Series. I've been to World Series. NBA Finals games, all of that. I always felt like every time I did a baseball game, a Brewer game, or a Bucks game, that I was watching a spectacle because I believe, and I know this to be true in my case, anytime you go to a sporting event, you can see something that you've never seen before. Could
You will.
happen,
You will.
often does. And you can also see something that has never happened before,
Anywhere.
anywhere, anytime.
Have you seen the triple play?
I have seen a triple play. I've seen a triple play at the Class A level, one of the stranger triple plays with the Beloit Brewers when I called those games for a summer. One of the best summers of my life. I was out of baseball for a while with the Brewers, and I was able to call the Beloit Brewers, and they came within one victory of a Midwest League Championship. So that was a wonderful summer. And I just walked in, and that was on radio. I just walked in and did baseball, and that summer gave me a lot of confidence. There's not a lot of preparation you can do at that level. So I just went in and did baseball, and it taught me an awful lot. And I used that in my second stint in the major leagues with the Brewers in 95 and 96. But I remember walking into the Beloit Brewers Stadium and hearing the crack of the bat. And
Yeah.
to me, that was a spectacle point for me because I'm going, man, there's no place like this.
Let me ask you if you consider this spectacle. At County Stadium, we used to be lean on the cage while they were taking BP, and you could shoot the bull with Ken Griffey Jr. You could Tony La Russa's on my left. Where else are you going to get that? You don't get it today. You need a passport to get, that close to him now. And is that spectacle as well? And is it also spectacle where you take a moment out of it? Like my favorite story writing for the Brewers, you wouldn't believe. It's not about a player. It's about the time at Miller Park when I was able to go to the video room. Do you know that video room off the dugout?
Sure.
That to me was my favorite story out of the couple hundred I wrote, whatever, because it was unique. No media, I would technically wasn't media, so no media member could go in there during a game. And I would see Ryan Braun come in from left, and then I'd turn around and he's right here over my shoulder. Now, is that spectacle or are we talking something else here?
I think the whole thing is a spectacle. I think there's an aura about the entire world of sport that makes it a spectacle. And then I think there are, Super Bowls and Game
Yeah.
Sevens and that type of thing. Maybe what we saw recently with the USA Canada hockey game, the beginning of that spectacle. It's just this feeling that engulfs you and pulls you in. But I agree, standing around the cage, you ignited a story in my mind that I don't know if I should tell it or not,
Hey,
but
this is cable.
you remember Duffy Dyer?
I know the name and I never met him, but I know Duffy. He used to play
Duffy was a coach.
Angels.
Well, he was a coach with the Brewers,
Oh,
and
yeah,
they were
okay.
let go. And the next season, I'm at the cage, and Duffy is with the opposing team, standing on an AstroTurf mat, hitting fungos to the infielders to the left of the cage. And it came time, and somebody came over and they said, Duffy, can you move? And they took that AstroTurf mat away, and it was time to quit. And I'm standing there, and Duffy looks at me and he says, "That's not the first time they pulled the rug from under me here."
That's clever.
That was great, right? I
That's
never forgot
clever.
it. I mean, you just triggered that, and that's one thing. But sure, yeah, that's spectacle, right? When you're involved in that, when you're on the inside,
Well,
I think it's
that's the
totally
thing.
different when you're on the inside.
You know, I look at beat writers, I'm like, that bores me. I mean, beat writing would bore me to tears because, you got your nice intro, but and the stats on the game. I mean, but when I write, like when I talk to American Pie was written by Don McLean. You remember him, right? American
Of
Pie.
course, yeah.
I don't have much that I'm overly crazy proud of, but I interviewed him and he sent me a CD signed, and that to me is. But my point is, when I talked to him, my first question wasn't about American Pie. I just asked him, "What kind of acts are you playing today?" And he laughed. If you can start an interview, ingratiating yourself to somebody as opposed to thoughts on the game. Did you try to do that when you talk to people? Did you try to make a connection? Because my philosophy is once you start something like that and hit them, I can't tell you how many people have said, "Wow, that's interesting," and you start off that way. I think that's an entirely different interview from that moment on. Would you agree to some extent that
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting question. I always tried to tread lightly. I tried to. I always viewed it this way, Jim. The athletes and coaches and people in sport are bombarded by questions,
right?
interviewers, and I always tried to go lightly because I didn't want to be like everyone else and just, take their time. They have families and, so I just sort of I hung, I was
Yeah,
kind of around and tried to pick my spots. And it worked pretty well for me. They allowed me to speak when I wanted to because I wasn't speaking all the time.
right.
And that worked pretty well. So yeah, I mean, I remember again, this was in the third base dugout at County Stadium, and I, Reggie Jackson was there, and I asked him if he would consent to an interview, and he said, "Yeah, I'll do an interview if you don't ask me any questions about baseball."
See, I would have loved it.
And you know what I got out of him that day? We talked about the fact that when he was in Milwaukee, he would get a rental car and drive all over the state of Wisconsin looking for muscle cars in people's barns. He would buy muscle cars all over this state. He'd find them, and that's what he did in his off time here. It was one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever done. And Reggie set it up. He said, "Yeah, if you don't ask me any baseball questions, I'll do
That
it."
would have been my favorite interview to do stuff like that. Like even in this, I didn't mean to get into your career. I mean, because I don't want. I mean, we know you as a broadcaster. I wanted to know more, but Euchre took us in this, and but we're also talking about something that I always come back to the intangible. We're talking about moments that have meant something to you, and that'll mean something to your interview subject as well when they sense that you're more than just the nuts and bolts. For
I
me,
agree. I think you have to. I think you're fortunate when those things fall to you, and you have to be. So many interviewers and reporters go in with a script,
yeah,
and I did that too. I was guilty of that when I started. I didn't
sure,
know what I was doing, so I had to outline my thoughts and okay, boom, 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 boom. And when you're doing that, you're not listening.
you're
When you're
not.
listening and reacting, it takes you in different places. So those were the best. And you know, the spectacle, one of the great spectacles of all of this for me is the number of people that we've met.
Yeah,
You can say you've met a lot of people. I've met a ton of people, and when people say, "Jim, you should write a book," if I ever wrote a book, it would be just what we're doing here. You're triggering these little things that I remember. I'm going to start writing all those down
you have to.
so I have them because there are so many of them and they pop into my mind now that I'm retired and I just smile or laugh. I mean, it's such a blessing and a spectacle, if you will, in its own way that has made this just such a wonderful career and a great life.
One of the things that I love about, the freelancing world has died. It's, dancing on its grave because, nobody's reading. But one day I would write about a politician. The next day I'd go down and talk to a Hall of Famer. The next day I would talk to a film person in LA. And to me, I'm so lucky to be able to feed my curiosity from so many different angles. And I think that is critical to what I'm trying to do here on this channel, but also, you know, to find those uncovered gems that you never knew existed. And in this book that I got to talk to some of the biggest names in radio, and the funny thing about that, Jim, some of them, and I don't remember who it was, but said, yeah, some of these guys take a stance that they don't really believe in. The next day, they'll say it as a role. Like, let's say they say, I don't want to get specific and political here, but they'll be someone else than they are on the air. Like Vin Scully, I figure was Vin Scully. I think Ernie Harwell was Ernie Harwell. Did you find that a lot of these really long lasting guys had to be themselves? And I think we alluded to this a little earlier.
I would say it this way. I'm not sure they get to where they are without being themselves. And someone asked me in a job interview one time, who do you emulate? And I said, I emulate no one. I said, to me, there are only originals in halls of fame.
Right. I
That's
like
how I say it. And that has held up over my career. I think that some of the biggest names are some of the greatest people. And Ernie
agree.
Harwell, you can't say enough good things about Ernie Harwell. You can't say, Bob Euchre, on and on and on. I never had the privilege of meeting, some of them, but Vin Scully was one that I never got to meet because the Brewers were in the American League when I was doing the games. But I've met others, and for the most part, I'd say that the bigger they are, the nicer they are, and the more compelling they are.
I wrote a book on the film Bull Durham, which is, making of. I got Bob Costas and George Will to call me, and two guys that, could have blown me off. And they were two of the nicest. And I'm not kissing up to you, but for you to do this for me, I feel that way too. And thank you.
Well, it's my privilege.
Well, yeah, right.
Oh, it is. I appreciate it.
Well, to have those guys.
I like talking about this stuff. It's
Well,
fun.
I like talking about anything but I'd leave the game at seventh inning when I could because after a while going to the locker room was tedious, and nobody would understand that unless you knew it for all these years. But
Phil Rizzuto left games in the seventh inning, and he was getting paid to be there.
it's just I got to tell you one anecdote. I'm up in Miller Park. Marty Welskoff is such an amazing guy. I mean, what I love about those two, the Pope could come up to him. They'd be like, "You having lunch today?" They were never enamored or blown away. And Marty, I don't know if there is anybody that would impress him. So one day I'm leaning over and I said, "Who's that guy over there?" It was a diminutive guy who, looks like he could have sold insurance. And he goes, "Oh, that's Al Hrabosky." And I'm like, "What?" And here's a guy as a kid with the Fu Manchu, just scared the hell out of me watching him on TV, and he comes up to hear of me, and it's that illusion. And and the All-Star game at Miller Park, the one and only. I didn't know we weren't supposed to go in the locker room, the visiting locker room, not visiting. And I walked up there, and Frank Robinson and all these guys. That was a moment, an aha moment, where I said, "Damn, you're a lucky kid."
I
To
don't want to be a topper here, Jim, but
Yes, do
I
it.
have I have an Al Hrabosky story.
Oh,
When I worked in Peoria, Illinois, they had huge baseball banquets because they were between Chicago and St. Louis, and they would get everybody. The Cubs had come down. Pete Vanaken was Harry Carey's really close buddy. Pete was from Peoria. So they had these huge banquets. And Al would come in, and we sat together one night, and the table we were at fell off the stage onto the floor. So we had that in common. But when Al was getting out of baseball, there was a station in St. Louis, KPLR, that wanted him to be their sportscaster. And I got a call. I didn't know Al that well. And he said, "Jim," he said, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to take the job. Would you come down and help me put these shows together?" And so I went down and interviewed with KPLR. They offered me the job. And I'm going back to Peoria. And this is a strange thing about our business, too. A friend of mine at the station happened to know Jack Buck.
mm,
"Jim, I have somebody on the phone that you should probably talk to." "Hello, this is Jim Paschke." "Well, this is Jack Buck." He said, "I understand you have a chance to come to St. Louis." He said, "And I understand you have a chance to go to Madison, Wisconsin." He said, "Can I give you some advice?" I said, "Sure." "This is Jack Buck on the phone." And he said, "Jim, if you come to St. Louis, you're going to get pigeonholed." He said, "You're just not going to get a lot of opportunities." He said, "Go to Madison. You'll be doing play by play and everything you want very quickly. And I'll be darned if that isn't exactly what happened." So, the world's funny, but Al Hrabosky triggered all of that. And I ended up in Madison. And I don't know, a month after I was there, I was doing Badger football and basketball and working with Earl Gillespie on the football network. And that led me to come to Milwaukee. So, I have to thank Al for needing help.
Isn't that great? And Buck knew you were going to learn a blank ton more and do more in that kind of a smaller market. Jim, this thing's going to cut me off, and I wouldn't presume you want to do anymore. But if you did, I'd send you another link. But can we do this again sometime? Because I'm having a ball. But it's up to you. I mean,
I can do it. I can continue now. I can
let me
do it
send you.
whatever.
I gotta send you a new link because this thing cuts you off. So
Yeah,
I
sure. That's
will.
fine.
No, I
That's
want to say that now that this thing is gaining some traction, I'm going to lose you in a second here. The Pabst is asking me to bring people onto this channel, and I believe in Providence. I believe in doing something you love, and good things may come out of it. So I'm going to send you a new link, and then what I meant to say is I'm going to buy a subscription to this, so I don't have to do this. And I'll send you a link right now. So you got to do it again, okay?
okay. Great.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.